Greetings to everyone. This is Stephen Stine, the deacon at Christ Episcopal Church in Tyler, Texas. This morning, I'm preparing for you the August 2nd Christian education lesson as we continue our series of lessons from the letter to the Hebrews. And I will be presenting the lessons from Hebrews over the next several weeks until the end of August. So we begin with the lesson for August 2nd. That is the ninth Sunday after Pentecost. And that lesson will be the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 1 through 39. That is the entire chapter of Hebrews. And what I'm going to do this morning or today, depending on the time of day that you're watching this, I'm going to prepare this as a directed reading. In other words, I will read a section of the lesson and then offer some interpretation, some explanation, some ideas as to what the author of the letter to the Hebrews is saying. The first section begins chapter 11, the letter of Hebrews, verse 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. As we will see, this is an introduction to the argument that the writer of Hebrews is making concerning the Word of God. And this chapter begins with one of the most famous lines from the New Testament. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That is, what we hope for is not always what we immediately see. And what we immediately see may not necessarily be that which we hope for. That those things that are of great ultimate value may not be immediately available to the physical eye or to direct human experience. And this is an introduction to this lengthy argument that the author will make based on what Christians call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Remember that the letter of the Hebrews is written to people primarily of Judaic background, people who may not have heard much or had heard, or maybe nothing at all, about the Christian message. But they will have been inculcated, and that is deeply influenced by the message of the Hebrew Bible. And so the author of the letter of the Hebrews is trying to draw on those experiences to prove that Jesus is the Messiah foreseen in the literature of the Hebrews and the literature of the Jews, the Judaic body, the Judaic canon, and that therefore there is no disruption between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It is a continuation. So we pick up chapter 11, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain's. Through this, he received approval as righteous, God himself giving approval to his gifts. He died, but through his faith, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken so that he did not experience death, and he was not found because God had taken him. For it was attested before he was taken away that he had pleased God. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, for whoever would approach him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, warned by God about events as yet unseen, respected the warning and built an ark to save his household. By this, he condemned the world and became an heir to the righteousness that is in accordance with faith. So in this section, we have three people: Abel, Noah, and Enoch. Enoch, according to the Hebrew Bible, did not die. That is, he was transported, almost in the same sense that Mary, the Orthodox tradition, was transported. That she did not die, that she fell asleep. That is what is called the dormition of Mary, or somewhat closer to the close to the Roman Catholic interpretation, that Mary's body was taken into heaven, that she did not suffer death. Well, according to the Hebrew Bible, Enoch did not suffer death. That is why the passage says his body was not found. He was not found. He was somehow transported to heaven to serve God. All three of these people have done things in observance of in connection with their faith in God, but they have done things for which they did not know what the outcomes would be, but they did so through faith, and they were rewarded. Abel was rewarded by his gift being accepted to God. Enoch was rewarded by being taken into God's presence. Noah was rewarded by seeing that the signs that he expected, that he received from God, in fact came to fruition, and that he was prepared to deal with them, that is, the flood and the destruction of the world. We resume with chapter 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, he received power of procreation, even though he was too old, and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. We'll continue directly with Abraham, but let's pause for a minute and look what this passage says. Abraham, one of the most important figures, one of the great figures in the Old Testament, was seen as not only the father of Israel, the founder of Israel, but was also seen as a man who continually followed the instructions of God. And as we'll see in a moment, even to the point of being willing to offer his son as a sacrifice. Here we see that Abraham, first of all, is willing to go to a foreign land. He leaves the comfort of his home in Ur, which is now part of modern-day Iraq, and was willing to follow God's commands. Because, as verse 10 says, for he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He was looking for something bigger. He was looking for something more important than just where he happened to live. And in an extraordinary life, late in his life, according to the Hebrew Bible, he was 80 years old, as was his wife Sarah. They are able to conceive a child who becomes Isaac. They are able to conceive a child. And in one of my favorite lines, verse 12, therefore from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. It's not absolutely clear as to which person was nearly dead, but we can assume that both Abraham and Sarah were of a very advanced age, that it was unlikely that Sarah was still fertile, and it may be that Abraham was not fertile. But Their fertility is established for God's purpose. And this adds to this remarkable life of Abraham. Let's resume with verse 13. All these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. So this is a summary of the story to date. That is what happened to Cain, what happened to Enoch, what happened to Noah, and then what is happening to Abraham, because the story of Abraham resumes directly, are stories of people who put their trust in the faith that God gave them, and that they may not have seen immediate signs or immediate fruition or immediate fruits of the faith that they carried out, but it was an opportunity for them to show that they were carrying out God's purposes, and that they were seeking a better country. No matter where they had been or what they had been doing, they were seeking a better country. They were seeking a heavenly country, a country where they could freely and openly proclaim that the God of Israel, the God of the nation founded by Abraham, was the true God. And this was the God to whom, by whom their city, their spiritual city, and in a sense, their physical cities had been established. We pick up with the story of Abraham on verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, "It is through Isaac the descendant shall be named for you." He considered the fact that God is able even to raise someone from the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked blessings for the future on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions about his burial. Abraham's greatest contribution to understanding of faith was his willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac, something that God prevents him from doing. He prevents him from doing. But keep in mind that God himself, God the Father, was not willing to withhold the sacrifice of his own son. He does withhold sacrifice of Isaac and allows Abraham to make the proper sacrifice by sacrificing and killing a ram as on the altar that he's prepared to sacrifice Isaac. This is one of the most important events. This event that the writer of Hebrews is talking about is one of the most important events of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, and that is Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son. But the fact that his willingness allowed God to withhold the necessity for the sacrifice, and then to allow Isaac to continue invoking God's blessings on his sons, Jacob and Esau, and then on his descendant, Jacob, then on their descendant, Joseph, who, not knowing exactly how the people of Israel would be freed, but knowing that they would be freed, made preparations for his own burial outside of Egypt, making clear that he expected that the people of Israel would be delivered and that they would be returned from Egypt to their homeland. At verse 23, we pick up with Moses. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Moses, another gigantic, titanic figure in our Christian message and also in the Old Testament, very important in the Old Testament, is laying the foundations for Christianity. Moses gave up comfort, he gave up wealth, he gave up position as a member of the court of the Pharaoh because he had been adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter. He gave that up in order to live his life to the fullness that he believed was necessary as a Hebrew, because he was a Hebrew, and he forsook, gave up the comforts of the physical life that he enjoyed at the court of the Pharaoh for the persecution, for the pain, for the suffering that he felt he had to share with the Hebrews in order to attain something greater. And that was the ultimate redemption of the Hebrew people. And he did this through faith. He did this by observing what God asked him to do, by implementing the plagues, which ultimately forced the Pharaoh to release the Hebrews. We pick up at verse 29. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea, the people led by Moses, as if it were dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace. The story of Moses is continued. And Moses safely leads the people of Israel out of Egypt and into the promised land. And then the walls of Jericho are destroyed, and Jericho is occupied by the Hebrews because of the faith that the Hebrews had that they would prevail over the forces inside the walls of Jericho. And one of the most famous prostitutes, and there are a number of prostitutes who appear in the scriptures, Rahab, is mentioned because she did not perish, because she allowed the spies of Israel, who met them in peace, and allowed them to operate, and thus saved herself and the people of Israel. We continue at verse 32. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Starting with verse 32, we see a continuation of this theme about all the figures from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, who have followed God's instructions, even though they had to suffer as a consequence, because they had already sensed that they were being led to something greater, something bigger, something that would be far more fulfilling than anything that the physical world, that this world could provide them. And they suffered mightily. These were people who accepted torture, who accepted flogging, mocking, chains, imprisonment, who accepted destitution, who accepted all kinds of torments. And they were truly, as verse 38 says, of whom the world was not worthy. These are people who were greater than the physical world, who were greater than the world which offered other kinds of rewards, but rewards that were not anywhere near the fulfilling reward that came from serving God and from following his instructions. And this chapter concludes with verses 39 and 40. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. So what this passage is saying is that they had achieved, these people who had gone through so much, had achieved so much, great spiritual gifts, but they had not been yet made perfect, because their perfection, like our perfection, comes through the birth of Christ and through his sacrifice. And so the sacrifice of Christ, the death of Christ on the cross, the sacrifice that his Father, God the Father, was willing to make of him. And remember that God the Father had told Abraham he did not have to sacrifice his son Isaac, but God did not give himself that option. He sacrificed his own son. And he did so that might be made perfect. And so the perfection, the argument here is that the perfection of these great figures of the Hebrew Bible the perfection was not fully attained until they had become part of Christ's kingdom, and they had began to enjoy the fruits, the rewards of Christ's death. So this takes care of chapter 11, verses 1 through 40. I misspoke when I started the lecture. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 40. And I will hope to see you for the lesson on August the 9th, which will be the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 1 to 17. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Okay. you can. Download it. Okay, I've got it this far. And that's it. Okay.